Have you ever wondered how scientists, people deeply involved in evidence and facts, square that with personal beliefs, maybe even religious faith?
It's definitely something that sparks curiosity, especially when you see really prominent scientists who are also people of faith.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're jumping right into that. We've been reading through articles from a Medium blog called Scientists Free from Religion. It's edited by Jorge Garapires.
Right, and it's quite interesting because the blog actually invites scientists to share their own stories about this whole intersection, or maybe separation, between their work and beliefs.
So our mission here is to explore the arguments these articles are making. They tend to focus on the potential friction between a scientific sort of materialistic view and religious faith held by some scientists.
Yeah, we want to really unpack the perspectives in these pieces. They definitely offer a critical look at scientists, like Francis Collins, for example, who weave their faith into their science or public statements.
And they often bring up contrasts, right? Like comparing Collins to figures like Einstein or even Watson and Crick.
Precisely. We'll be looking at those comparisons as presented in the blog.
Okay, so first up, this idea of ego versus humility in science leadership. The articles draw a really stark contrast between Francis Collins, former NIH head, openly Christian, and someone like Albert Einstein.
Yeah, Einstein, while maybe spiritual in his own way, was famously skeptical about a personal God. And the blog highlights his intellectual rigor and, importantly, his humility.
So the blog asks, how much does ego play a role when scientists are in charge? They bring up confirmation bias, the tendency to favor ideas that already fit what you believe.
Which is always a risk in science, isn't it? The article suggests that for someone like Collins, holding deep religious beliefs while leading a major scientific institution like NIH, well, there's a potential for those beliefs to subtly influence decisions.
Right. And they point to Einstein as a counterexample. Even after huge breakthroughs, he seemed open to being wrong. They mentioned that time with Brownian motion.
Oh, yeah, where he admitted he hadn't personally checked all the experimental data. That shows a real intellectual honesty.
Exactly, a kind of humility. The blog argues Collins' deep faith might, maybe unintentionally, lead him to frame science in ways that align with his beliefs.
Which could affect how science gets communicated, both to the public and maybe even within the scientific community itself.
And this ties into a broader worry mentioned in the articles. Is intellectual humility, maybe, declining a bit in science today, with all the pressure to publish, get funding?
It's a fair question. Can ego really be kept in check in that kind of high-stakes environment? The blog contrasts Einstein engaging with Freud, totally different views, with maybe a less open culture today.
That willingness to engage with challenging ideas seems key.
Absolutely. The articles imply that the current system, focusing on positive results and grants, might not always encourage that deep self-questioning Einstein seemed to value.
Okay, let's shift a bit. The blog also gets into this divide between materialism and, well, theistic views. They bring up James Watson and Francis Crick.
The DNA guys. Yeah, the blog paints them as relentless materialists, completely focused on a purely scientific material explanation for everything.
A total contrast to Collins, who integrates his faith.
It's a fundamental difference in philosophy, really. Watson, as the blog notes, was pretty upfront about his atheism. He basically thought science would eventually explain everything, making religion unnecessary.
Crick, too. He saw religion as sort of outdated.
Pretty much. A materialist view of life, consciousness.
Yeah.
It all comes down to biology, chemistry, evolution. No need for anything beyond that.
So then you have Collins accepting evolution, genetics, but also believing in a personal God, his book, The Language of God.
Right, where he suggests DNA itself could be seen as divine evidence. The blog is pretty clear that Watson and Crick would have been, well, deeply skeptical of that, to put it mildly.
And the blog stresses it's not about questioning Collins' scientific skill, it's the philosophy.
Exactly. For Watson and Crick, based on the blog's portrayal, mixing faith with the scientific process itself would be a fundamental problem for a leader in science. Their view was science needs rigorous, evidence-based skepticism, completely separate from the supernatural.
It makes you wonder, as the blog seems to, if modern science leadership has shifted. Maybe prioritizing diplomacy or public engagement over that kind of brutal honesty.
That's the undercurrent, isn't it? Has the need to connect with society, navigate different beliefs, maybe sometimes diluted that hardcore intellectual rigor that perhaps characterized figures like Watson and Crick.
Okay, let's zero in on one specific argument the blog tackles a lot, fine-tuning. Francis Collins uses this idea, right, that the universe's constants seem perfectly set for life, pointing to a creator.
He does, but the blog argues Einstein would have had a big problem with that line of reasoning.
Because of Einstein's focus on simplicity. Occam's razor.
Exactly. The blog emphasizes that. For Einstein, the simplest explanation is usually best. The fine-tuning argument from that viewpoint adds a huge layer of complexity, this divine tuner, instead of looking for natural explanations first.
Why jump to a tuner when maybe there are physical laws or processes we just don't understand yet? Invoking God isn't really a scientific explanation in that sense.
And the blog takes pains to clarify Einstein's own God talk. He wasn't a theist in the conventional sense. No personal intervening God.
Right, like God doesn't play dice was about quantum randomness, not religion. He likes Spinoza's idea of God as the laws of nature.
So the blog argues Einstein would see Collins's take on fine-tuning as injecting personal belief where it doesn't belong scientifically.
He'd likely see it as a sign we just don't understand the physics well enough yet.
That's the contention. Einstein would push for deeper science, maybe multiverse ideas, whatever, not jump to divine intervention.
This brings up another point the blog makes about expertise. They use Einstein struggling with quantum mechanics later in life as an example. Even geniuses hit limits.
Right. And then they ask, what about Francis Collins, a biologist, making big claims about fine-tuning, which is really physics and cosmology?
That's a central criticism in these articles. Collins is brilliant in genetics, no question. But fine-tuning arguments, that's not his field.
And the arguments he uses are heavily debated, often refuted, by physicists who actually work in cosmology and fundamental physics.
It's that general issue of scientists speaking with authority outside their own specific field.
Yeah. Interdisciplinary thinking is great, but making definitive claims in another complex field. The blog suggests caution is needed. And invoking God, they argue, just adds complexity, violating that Einsteinian push for simplicity.
So the conclusion in the blog is that Collins' fine-tuning arguments are essentially more theological than scientific.
Which leads into this idea the blog calls the ignorance bet.
The ignorance bet, what's that?
Basically, using the gaps in our current scientific knowledge to make a case for God. The blog argues Collins does this with fine-tuning.
Because it's a physics claim, outside his biology expertise. And physicists themselves don't even agree on what slightly different constants would really mean.
Precisely. And they draw a parallel with Newton. Newton saw symmetry in nature as God's design. But now we understand biological imperfections, mutations.
Yeah.
It's not so perfectly symmetrical.
So the blog sees Collins doing something similar, inserting God into the gaps of cosmology.
That's the argument. And they also point out a potential bias. Why does fine-tuning point specifically to the Christian God? It seems kind of culturally specific.
It's a recurring pattern they critique. Scientists from one field, maybe engineers pushing intelligent design and biology, or a biologist on fine-tuning in physics, challenging consensus based on what looks like a theological leaning.
Right. The blog's stance is clear. Science should be about finding answers, not stopping at unanswered questions and saying God did it.
So why do smart people, scientists included, hold beliefs that might seem at odds with evidence? The blog touches on cognitive biases, like confirmation bias.
Yeah, and this interesting idea of domain-specific intelligence. Being brilliant at science doesn't automatically mean you apply the same critical thinking everywhere, like religious beliefs.
They mentioned islands of false beliefs, like people compartmentalize.
Kind of, shielding certain beliefs from conflicting evidence. The blog also talks about strategic beliefs, beliefs that maybe aren't about factual accuracy, but serve other needs.
Like providing purpose, a moral compass, community, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And they see Collins' theistic evolution fitting evolution into his faith as an example of structuring beliefs to coexist with science.
So beliefs, even for scientists, can be about more than just facts. They serve psychological, social roles too.
Okay, but what about the sheer complexity of the genome? Doesn't that look like design? The blog tackles this head-on.
They acknowledge the wonder, right? But argue invoking God actually complicates things.
Yeah, the infinite regress problem. If the genome needs a complex designer who designed the designer, it just pushes the question back.
Instead, they argue for evolution, natural selection, mutation, genetic drift.
As a simple, powerful, evidence-based explanation for how complexity arises naturally over time, no designer needed.
And these aren't just theories, right? We can observe these mechanisms.
Absolutely. Plus, the blog points out the messiness of the genome junk DNA, genetic flaws. That makes more sense with evolution's trial and error process than with a perfect designer.
Evolution gives a grounded explanation without needing a creator of the creator.
It's presented as this elegant, sufficient explanation for life's complexity.
So pulling it together, the blog's critique of Collins, especially on fine-tuning, is pretty pointed. They respect his genetics work, but sees cosmology arguments as outside his lane and kind of human-centered.
That anthropocentric trap thinking the universe must be for us, the blog uses that puddle analogy.
The puddle thinking the hole is made perfectly for it.
Exactly. Maybe life just adapted to the universe as it is, not the other way around. And they mentioned physicists like Stenger, Hawking, Carroll, Hassenfelder,
Who largely reject fine-tuning as proof of design, offering other scientific ideas instead. Constrained constants, multiverse, different views on causality.
Right. The blog basically accuses Collins of letting religious bias drive his interpretation here. They question the whole probability argument for fine-tuning. We don't know if constants could be different or what the odds really are.
And they contrast skepticism about the multiverse, which is at least potentially scientific, with the acceptance of an unobservable God. Seems like a double standard from their perspective.
Yeah, and they bring up ideas like Lee Smolins, maybe life isn't even that special, maybe other kinds of complexity could exist with different laws.
So fine-tuning ends up looking like another God of the gaps argument. History shows those gaps tend to get filled by science eventually.
That's the final take in these articles. They see Collins pushing a religious agenda dressed up as science. They even tackle his specific claim about gravity.
That slightly weaker gravity means no universe.
Yeah, they call that speculation, like parallel universe talk, and remind us we don't even fully grasp gravity at tiny scales yet. Filling those unknowns with God is just flawed science, according to the blog.
Okay, so let's try to summarize the main threads from these Scientists Free from Religion blog articles edited by Jorge Garapitos. There's this core tension: scientific materialism versus religious faith in scientists.
Right. Concerns about ego, maybe less intellectual humility today. A really strong critique of the fine-tuning argument as unscientific outside expertise and possibly biased.
Plus, the idea of strategic beliefs and the strong emphasis on evolution as fully capable of explaining life's complexity without needing a designer.
And we should reiterate, these are the arguments from this specific blog offering a critical viewpoint. It's a platform for scientists who feel this way.
It definitely leaves you with a lot to chew on. Thinking about all this, what does it really mean for a scientist to be free from religion in their work? Is that total separation truly possible, or even always the goal?
That's a great question. And if the universe isn't fine-tuned for us, like these articles argue, well, how does that change how you see our place in it all and what science is even trying to do? It really pushes you to examine your own assumptions about science and belief.